Hi class, welcome to our second lecture. Today we're going to start our first theory of international relations, and that is realism. So this should be a pretty interesting lecture. Let's go ahead and get into it. Realism is one of the four theories of international relations that we're going to be discussing this semester, the others being liberalism, constructivism, and Marxism. But we'll spend a whole unit on each of these theories because there's a lot to unfold. So when broken down, we can call realism an approach to IR, international relations, guided by the belief that all states, all countries are motivated by their own self-interest. So the decisions that they make are going to stem off what they think is best for themselves. So pretty much everyone for themselves. Therefore, because you think everyone is on their own and essentially making decisions that serve them best, sometimes at the expense of other nations, you will see states prioritize national defense and security and practice a principle of what we call deterrence, that is, using your own strength and power to prevent other countries or discourage other countries from being aggressive towards you. Okay, so you build up a military, and a perfect example of this is the United States, right? We have this massive military, we have tons of nuclear weapons, tons of soldiers and equipment. And the idea there is we want to discourage others from trying to engage in war with us because it'd be so costly to engage in war. So let's keep going here. Now, a main tenet of realism is the belief in what we call the 911 problem. And it's pretty much what we're discussing about self-help and everyone for themselves. Essentially, there is no international police. Okay, so let's say someone broke into my home right now or was trying to break in. What would I do? I'd call the police. They'd send a police officer out here and they'd try to arrest this guy and protect me, right? That is their job. They're police officers. Now, what do you do in the international system when someone's trying to invade and take over your country? Is there an international police force that will come and arrest them? No, there's not. And the point that realists are making here is there is no international authoritative figure that you can call to handle your problems. Therefore, you must exercise what they call self-help. And that is a belief that you can only truly rely on yourselves for security. And because you can only truly rely on yourselves, you should build up strength in order to deter aggression, which we just spoke about in the last slide. So realists also have a belief that security interests, the preservation of your state trumps moral values. So morality shouldn't be something that gets in the way of protection and security. And we'll talk more about that later when we talk about Machiavelli, that prevailing belief, but keep that in mind for now. And realists would also recommend that states practice what is called realpolitik, also known as pragmatism. That is basically the belief that your political stances should be based on reactions to circumstances instead of a global or local standard of morality or ethics. Okay, so your decisions as a leader of a country should be based on what's going on in the world. And sometimes your reactions might be what we consider immoral or unethical, but that shouldn't matter. You react to the situation how you need to do it to best protect your state. So if you look at it through the guise of doing whatever you can to protect your country, it starts to make sense that morality and ethics may sometimes be pushed out the door, right? Because sometimes that response, the best response might not, but would be considered moral in all cases. Realists also believe in something called balancing, and that is when one state becomes too powerful, too large, the other smaller powers or other equal powers will band together to stop that conflict. And we talked a little bit about this in our last lecture. There's been constant attempts in Europe to take over the continent. What happened in those cases? You saw other European powers bound together to stop that main power. A perfect example, perhaps the most recent example would be World War II, right? You see Germany start to have the desire to conquer most of Europe, if not all of Europe, and you see the Allies join together to prevent Hitler's Nazi Germany from taking over other countries. And they got pretty far into Europe, but they ultimately lost. Realists also believe that there is no sovereign ruler over all nations. Again, this comes back into the 911 problem. There's no international government, there's no 911 to call, and therefore states are not subject to any sticking international law. And there are entities like the United Nations that band nations together, but realists would say when it comes down to it, a powerful state can ignore the United Nations and do what they want. A good example of that might be the United States prior to the 2003 invasion of Iraq. They asked the United Nations for approval. They did not get that, and they invaded Iraq anyways. So realists would point to something like that and say, it doesn't matter what kind of facade you want to put up through the United Nations or the League of Nations previously, whatever you do, the strong are going to do what they want, and the weak are going to have to react to that. And why did states believe that there isn't this international government? Essentially, we've talked about Hobbes in American Government, if you've taken that class. We're going to talk about him a little today as well. But essentially, that they believe the international system is anarchic. It's everyone for themselves, and the only way to survive is through amassing power. So all these beliefs I told you about, the self-help, the idea of deterrence, all come from the belief that the international system is indeed anarchic. Now, we're going to talk about two different types of realism today, classical realism and neorealism, starting with classical realism. Classical realism looks at the international system and says, okay, it is the way it is anarchy as a result of human nature. Human beings are in their natural state without government anarchic, and the international system is no different. It's everyone for themselves. There's no rules. People are going to do what is best for themselves and what gives them a better chance to survive, regardless of cultural norms or morality or ethics. Okay, so today we're going to talk about 4 different prominent realist thinkers and explore their teachings and hopefully have a stronger grasp of what realism actually is through this research. So let's start with Thucydides, the oldest international relations political scientist, we'll call him, that we're going to talk about this semester. Perhaps his most famous work is History of the Peloponnesian War. And he was Greek. He writes in the context of Greek city-states. Again, we talked about Greek city-states in our last lecture, really a microcosm of an international system, not the nation-state system that we have today as city-state system, but very telling and very eye-opening to relations between different powers. So Thucydides says that all states must realize that there is no balance of power necessarily. There's strong states and there's weaker states, and that's really all that matters. And you must be aware of that. The weaker states must be aware that there's stronger states out there and take the necessary steps to ensure their survival. Does that mean bowing down on certain issues? He would say, I think it does, right? Anything to ensure your survival, that is the job of the state. So if that means letting a stronger country walk over you in some situations, you do that to ensure the survival for your citizens. So something very interesting that he writes about is the difference between private morality and the principle of justice. And you see Machiavelli talked a little bit about the idea of morality as well. We'll talk about it in a second. But he says, normal everyday justice is different than justice in the international system or with international relations. And it's not really about equal treatment. Like I said before, you have to recognize your place and act accordingly, whether you're a strong or a small state. And he outlines that in the Melian Dialogue, one of his, again, more famous writings. And basically what he's saying, and you'll see how this fits into what we've been talking about so far, he's writing about a conversation between diplomats from Melos and Athens. Okay, so essentially what's going on, and this can get a little complicated, so it's a very interesting story, and I have the link to it in the later slides you'll see, but basically what's going on is Athens wants to use Melos, a smaller, weaker city-state, in their war against Sparta. So Athens and Sparta are fighting. Athens wants to use Melos as basically a base so they can more effectively fight Sparta. Melos doesn't want that. They want to remain neutral. Athens says, look, we need you as a base. We're going to conquer you. We'll let you be independent, but we're going to need to station people here. We're going to need to use this area for our war. And they say, surrender, or essentially, we are going to destroy you. So the Melians say that, no, it'd be cowardly of us, it'd be shameful. We have to fight you. We can't just let you conquer us. We have to preserve our autonomy. And the Athenians are not getting it. They're saying there's nothing shameful about admitting you're weaker than another country. They're the realists in this situation, right? He's writing them as the realists, while the Melians are the non-realists. So they say you should just admit defeat. There's nothing wrong with submitting to a stronger power. And they seem actually surprised at the Melos. Oops. So it ends up, they go back and forth, they're debating and arguing. And Athens says, look, here's the brass tacks. Either you submit to us or we're going to destroy you. Melians end up saying, no, we have to fight to preserve our autonomy. It would be cowardly. And what ends up happening is Athens invades the city, kills every man, and sells all women and children into slavery. So the kind of moral here, not too far there, the kind of moral here in the Melian Dialogue is that just what I told you before. He's writing from a realist perspective that you have to be aware of different power balances. In this case, Athens is very strong and Melos is very weak, so they should have realized that and submitted. There's no such thing as cowardice or shame or pride in the international system. He's saying it's foolish to act like for a small country, a weak country, to stand up to a strong country when you know it's going to completely destroy your entire nation, or in this case, your entire city-state. So the pragmatist or the realist would have submitted, but they did not. And the moral of the story is they killed all of them. So very interesting work. And I included the link a couple slides back. You can go check it out. The next realist we're going to talk about is Niccolo Machiavelli. His most famous work is The Prince. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's dense, but it's a very telling and very good book. Here's a quote I really like from him, from The Prince. The lion cannot protect himself from traps, and the fox cannot defend himself from wolves. One must therefore be a fox to recognize traps and a lion to frighten wolves, right? So he's saying you have to be cunning, you have to be the best of both worlds. So Machiavelli wrote that, the world is very dangerous, and if you want to survive in this dangerous world, you have to take precautions against others and protect yourself. So again, going back to the realist principle of self-help and self-preservation, that's basically what he's saying. He also says, however, that independence is the goal of the state. So you have to do whatever you can to defend your interests, survive, and hopefully remain autonomous and independent. Therefore, the ruler must be very strong, must be very cunning, right? So he's writing The Prince as basically a way of how one should rule a country. So he says that the best kind of leader will exploit whatever opportunity they can for his or her state. And this requires oftentimes that the leader be ruthless, that the leader be cruel. Why? Because ultimately in this cruelty, in this exploitation, as long as they're doing it to protect their state, it's ultimately a good thing. It's ultimately moral. So he actually says that a good leader will not act in accordance to Christian principles, that, being the golden rule of love thy neighbor, turn the cheek, etc., do not lie. To him, the best kind of ruler is one that's going to lie, cheat, and steal to make his or her nation stronger. That's morality to him, protecting your citizens, remaining strong, remaining independent. So he might actually look at our concept of morality and say it's foolish. It's not something you should be doing because it puts your country and yourself in danger. Our next realist type thinker we're going to talk about, Thomas Hobbes. Famous quote from him: life is nasty, brutish, and short. Not an optimist. His most famous work is probably Leviathan, written in 1651. And a lot of this realist type thinking comes from Hobbes' writings. He wrote more on a domestic scale, but we can apply what he wrote to an international sphere as well. So the question he kind of tries to answer is, what would happen if all governments ceased to exist? And he says it would devolve into anarchy, which we talked about before. That is, everyone for themselves, killing, stealing, murdering, whatever it is, to get what they want. Because without government, with lack of government, human beings are essentially barbaric animals. So as I said, nature's anarchy, human beings are cruel. However, he would say that human beings, above all other animals, are reasonable. And this reason can remove us from the anarchy that is nature. And therefore, it is reasonable to submit ourselves to a government. His two laws are, we all want peace, and we are all rational enough to recognize that if we form a government, give up certain rights, there can be peace. Okay. And he details a contract between the state and the people, right? He's one of the first Enlightenment thinkers to really talk about this contract. Okay, so we're going to skip a couple of things on Hobbes here because we're going to try to focus more on the international aspect of this course. Our last thinker, realist thinker we're going to talk about is Hans Morgenthau, the most recent realist we're going to talk about. A famous quote from him: "The struggle for power is universal in time and space and is an undeniable fact of experience," right? So he's saying again, power, the search for power is ultimately everything. So Morgenthau would agree with Hobbes in that he believes human beings are very self-centered, act in their own self-interest and self-interested. And because people like this, politics is going to be like that as well. So power, the search of power to dominate others, is natural in human beings, and therefore we crave it. And that's why we have this anarchic system. He would also agree that the ultimate goal of any state, with Machiavelli here, is to survive. However, he would say that beyond the borders of your nation, it's impossible to guarantee this. Right? A strong government can guarantee protection within a nation, but beyond the borders, it's a madhouse. All bets are off, and you have to act accordingly. If you're a leader of a government, you have to act accordingly. So he created what he calls power politics, and the belief that is how politics are a struggle for power over men. Right? So that's what power is to him: the will, the need, the wish to dominate over others. So he's saying, if you enjoy your autonomy, if you want to be a country that rules itself and is left alone, you must use power to dominate others. So he's basically making it very black and white, right? He's making it somewhat of a zero-sum game here, saying, in the international system, you're either one, someone who gets dominated by other countries, or two, someone who dominates other countries. And he's saying everyone wants to be the latter. And you should take steps to ensure that you are the latter. So he says, talking about morality, or we talked a little bit more about morality with Machiavelli. He says that, and Machiavelli gets into this as well, so it's very interesting. He says that there's two different types of morality, right? There's private morality and public morality. Politicians, leaders in their public life should be moral and ethical and, shake hands, kiss babies, but privately they must be brutal. That's a different type of morality. They got to do whatever it is, cut throats, to make sure that their nation state can remain independent. He's saying, if you're not willing to do this, if you're not willing to be that ruler who lies, cheats, and steals, then you're ultimately putting your own people's lives in risk, and that's in itself somewhat immoral. So he would even go as far to say that sometimes you must trample on human rights for the sake of national interest, and the ends can sometimes justify the means. So what does that mean? If you have to do something horrible that'll benefit your nation, ultimately keep you safe, you should do it. So let's say like something like torture, very controversial issue, right? Let's say we capture a known terrorist suspect. Should we torture information out of them to prevent further attacks? Morgenthau, Machiavelli would say absolutely. In fact, perhaps it's immoral not to torture them, because if you don't torture them and get the information, it makes a terrorist attack in your country all the more likely. Okay, so it's a very hard line way of thinking. I'm not saying this is the right way of thinking, guys. I want to separate that. I'm saying this is how some realists would frame the questions. Frame the question that it's ultimately bad if you don't use acts of sometimes even extreme violence to protect your state. It's a very hard line way of thinking. Okay, so that's going to do it for lecture 2, part A. I will have a part B up, so go ahead and please tune into that.